Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is part of our series on Vedic times. Friends, I would like to tell you that previously early Vedic times has been discussed already by our subject expert, and today he shall trace the transition from early Vedic times to the later Vedic period, and I would like to introduce our subject expert. Here we have with us Dr. Shankar Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. Thank you so much, sir, for coming.
Thank you, Urvashi, and good afternoon, viewers. We have already begun our discussion in the earlier interaction that I had with you around the Vedic times. And as I can remember, last time we spoke about the beginning of the Vedic times. We emphasized as to how Vedic period is somewhat different in character, in economy, in its other details with respect to the Harappan times. We also spoke of several historians who do insist that there can be some kind of similarity between the Harappan times and the Vedic times, and the two constitute basically a continuum. So we saw the merit and demerit of that. And we also spoke about the sources that we use to reconstruct the history of the early Vedic period, and also, of course, of the later Vedic period. We spoke of some of the basic characteristic features of the economy of the early Vedic times revealed through Rig Veda, and also a little bit of archaeological correlate that we have in the form of pre-iron painted graveware culture. On the basis of that, we sought to reconstruct the economic profile of the early Vedic times, where we spoke about the predominance of pastoralism as the dominant way of life, in contrast to agriculture, which subsequently went on to become the predominant way of life. So, having discussed that, we also spoke of the centrality of cow, or you can say gau in Sanskrit, which reveals the centrality of cow is actually revealed by the sheer vocabulary, the sheer richness of vocabulary around this word gau. And we spoke of several words, critical words referred to in Rig Veda, which presupposes cow as the central element, or whose root word is gau, which stands for cow. And then we spoke of Gotra concept and so forth, which again brings cow pen into focus. And therefore, the point that we are stressing upon is that through this study of, or you can say etymological evidence revealed through Rig Veda, it appears that Rig Vedic people were essentially pastoral people with little bit of knowledge of agriculture, and we shall see as to how we can see the transformation or progress in the course of the life of the Aryans, and the way they met with people around, indigenous people who had been living in this area from before, probably doing little bit of agriculture. And it is as a result of this interaction, which is not always limited to warfare. Let's understand this, that this kind of cultural interaction was not always violent with the advent of agriculture, or with the agriculture becoming the predominant way of life, because agriculture allows enough surplus production to ensure that bigger groups can survive on a limited space, and they need not exterminate the other group in the vicinity, as could have been the case in the pre-agricultural times, where the dependence on natural resources was almost absolute, and therefore there was absolutely no way in which two groups or bigger group of people could survive or subsist over a defined space for a longer duration of time. So there was this kind of an obvious limitation. But with the agriculture intensifying and with agriculture becoming the way of life, of course, this possibility was increased. There were other avenues, so people could cooperate, people could coexist, and yet continue to live with the surplus generated by agriculture and so forth. So we are talking of the times when early Vedic society is getting transformed into a society where increasingly we will see what we designate as later Vedic times from 1000 to 600 BC as the period where such possibilities are opened up. There is a corresponding geographical shift also eastward from the Sapta Sindhu area to the Gangetic plains, middle Gangetic plains. So all these areas are getting colonized by peasant society with a fair degree of agriculture, and there is a corresponding change in the technology of production. There are new metals, most noticeably iron coming into picture, which is again a debatable issue amongst historians. Nevertheless, in terms of archaeological evidence and literary evidence also, we do find that iron is increasingly becoming important. What was its level of usage in the actual process of production, say cultivation and so forth, that is slightly debatable. Nevertheless, in terms of warfare, in terms of weapons and so forth, definitely iron makes a big presence in the later Vedic times, and we shall see it is these aspects, and of course the corresponding social and organizational changes that it triggered. Also, let's not forget the political profile getting changed. So that is basically what we shall try to track down today in the course of our discussion. So continuing from where we had left last time when I had an interaction with you, I think we were talking about the centrality of cow in the Rigvedic life and the terms associated with it. And we had also said that cattle constituted the chief item of gift or chief item of dan as it was offered during sacrifices which were conducted during the Rigvedic period by the priests in the presence of the rajas, the kshatriyas or the rajanya, which constituted the two upper categories or the two upper varnas in the fourfold varna division of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. And this dan, which was offered by people and was reciprocated by the king back to the people with little bit of a sense of asymmetrical redistribution. This offering by the people is listed as bali. So bali actually refers to this kind of voluntary offering in the Rigvedic times by the Vish or the common people to the sacrifices which was conducted at the behest of the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, because the Raja was presumably a Kshatriya and the priests were Brahmins. So that is how there is material redistribution happening in terms of what the common people or society in general produces and what is getting redistributed through these mechanisms. So point to remember is that this bali is voluntary. It is not coercive and it is not any kind of a tax at around this point of time. And we shall see as to how over a period of time it got transformed. But before that, let's try and understand as to what all constituted bali. What were the items included in bali? What were actually offered by the common people? And that again tells us that agriculture does not seem to be a very important occupation in the early Vedic times, because what was offered by people in dana or gift giving on these occasions basically had very limited and unimportant representation of agriculture. Land or grain are not the objects of gift giving. They not even constitute the objects of dispute. So, maybe we can understand that still they had not come to acquire the kind of value that we usually associated with agricultural grains and land, which is so critical to agriculture and so forth. There are no prayers, very little prayers in Rig Veda which anticipates or which wants grains from God. So, or for that matter land. So, people offer prayers to gods, they offer sacrifices and they list various items that they want from God, and land is not very importantly listed in these items, which again tells us that probably agriculture was yet to become the central element of production. Then the chiefs, the Rajas of Rigvedic times were also not obliged to protect land. They were obliged to protect several other things, most importantly the chief form of wealth, that is gau, that is cow. And so, gau is something which is to be protected by the chief or the Raja, and therefore, in Rigvedic times or the early Vedic times, the Raja or the chief is also referred to as Gopati. So, he is the master of the cattle wealth, but he is not projected as someone who is supposed to look after or protect one particular piece of one particular patch of land or territory for that matter, which subsequently happens, and that is what again we are going to see today. The only grain which is referred to in Rig Veda is Yava, and this term Yava is understood by the historians to connote either in generic terms all the grains that they were familiar with, or maybe that it referred specifically to barley. So, again either it represents barley or whatever grains that they produced. Now, the fact that there are no specific names associated with different species of grains again tells us that probably their familiarity with the grain range, with the range of grains is very limited, and that again reinforces this assertion that agriculture was yet to become very important, because subsequently in later Vedic times we do find separate terms for separate grains, but that is something which is missing in Rig Veda, and they are content with using a generic word probably for whatever grains that they knew about, and that is Yava. Now, individual ownership of land can be yet another pointer towards the value of land or the centrality of land, and we find that land in Rig Vedic times or the early Vedic times is still communally held, and there is no individual land ownership which is spoken of in Rig Veda, which again tells us the limited value which was associated with land in the absence of agriculture in the early Vedic times. Of course, there is some bit of distanciation which one can see in social category terms with respect to the Brahmins and the Rajanya categories on one side, and the common people, that is Vish or the direct producers. So, Vish probably are engaged in the process of production directly whereas the first two categories, Brahmins and Rajanya, or what subsequently went on to be referred to as Kshatriyas, their participation in the process of production is not that direct. So, there is some kind of tendency to have access to those mechanisms through which surplus is extracted, and maybe on account of some asymmetric redistribution through whatever, it could be rituals, it could be political clout, or other non-production issues, that we do see this kind of distanciation between the direct producers and not so direct producers emerging in the Rigvedic period. Most importantly, from the etymological point of view, is also a fact that the term for agriculture in Rigved is a loan word. What do we mean by loan word is, since we have already spoken about the fact that Aryans who constituted a language group, they, when they settled in this area, of course, they had their own vocabulary, and some of the terms that they used have their cognates in Indo-Iranian language and other Indo-European languages, the big family of languages that the Aryans belonged to. So, there are quite a few words related to say cattle or animal husbandry, which have cognates in other Indo-European languages, but the term that they used with reference to agriculture seldom have cognates in other Indo-Aryan languages. What does it tell us? It tells us that probably they took to agriculture once they settled in this area, and they were not familiar with agriculture in a big way while they had not settled, or in the times prior to their settlement in the Saptasindhu area, or eastward movement that we are trying to track. For instance, the word for plow in Rigved is langal. Now, langal is a word which is not of Indo-Aryan origin or Indo-European origin. In fact, it could be a borrow from Munda language, which is again an autochthonous tribe which lived in India from a period prior to the advent of the Aryans and so forth. Similarly, words for cereals and plants which are there in Vedic sources are again not having any cognates in Indo-Aryan languages. So, they are also probably borrowed terms from the local people who had been living in this area and probably practicing agriculture, whereas the words for instance cow itself, the words that is gau, the words related with cattle and animal domestication do have their cognates in other Indo-European languages. Now, coming to the other segment of economy, if we look at the scenario around craft production, then we find that in Rigved again they are sparsely referred to. So, there are very few references associated with craft activities in Rigved. Of course, we do have some groups of people working on say leather. So, there are leather workers referred to, wheelwrights are mentioned, smiths are mentioned, potters are mentioned in Rigved. And interestingly, these social groups are not accorded low social status, which subsequently they came to acquire. But in Rigved, we do not find much of an evidence where these craftsmen or crafts groups are accorded any low social status with reference to social prestige. Maybe that chariot making and other such crafts are so critical to the life and times of the early Vedic people that they are accorded high status, and they are so critical to one's success in war, and therefore they constituted honorable jobs or occupations. And subsequently, when agriculture becomes so central to the lives of people, then we find that these activities are there, but they are not so important to the everyday life or to one's success in war and so forth. So, these groups undergo some kind of a decline in social status terms, and which we shall try to capture through the dynamics of caste, the way it evolved, the way it progressed in Indian history. Talking of metals and its references, again we find that in Rig Veda we have this term ayas mentioned, which some historians claim that it might refer to iron, but there is a general consensus amongst historians that it could represent either copper or bronze, and certainly not iron. So, one can again presume that iron is yet to be leveraged as such, or people are not aware of iron or iron production as such in early Vedic times, and there is certainly a very limited usage of iron in agriculture or the productive activities, be it and this is true even for later Vedic times. I mean, mere presence of iron artifacts do not testify to the fact that they were used in productive works like agriculture in a big way. So, even in later Vedic times there is a limited usage to which iron was used in the process of production. It had to wait till the time, say the middle of the first millennium BC, around 700 600 BC only, that we find that iron starts getting used as plowshare, and therefore its implication for agricultural production cannot be stretched to a period before 700 BC or so. In terms of pottery, again we find that as in agriculture, which we shall see that in the later Vedic times people took to agriculture on account of contact with local people, on account of some kind of amalgamation with the local culture. Similarly, pottery also seems to be a byproduct of this process of amalgamation with the local population. Why do we say this? Is because again the Vedic word for potter, that is kulal, is not having any parallel in the Indo-European languages. Now again, had they been aware of potter or pottery making in a big way, then all these branches of people who had come from the same language stock could have had similar or parallel words for these terms, as is the case with dairy products or cattle and so forth. But again, pottery making as a craft also seems to be a byproduct of the process of amalgamation of the Aryans with the local people. Weaving, of course, it appears from the study of Rigvedic details that it probably was a domestic craft, and women had a lot to do with this. So, it seems that the entire business of weaving as a domestic craft was controlled by women or women folk. Of course, we know of sheep, which is part of the cattle belt, which is part of the animal stock in the pastoral phase of Aryan life in the early Vedic times. So, the wool required for weaving could be procured from the sheep that they domesticated. And interestingly, which is again important for us to understand, there is no reference to cotton in Rig Veda. Now, why this is important is if we talk of the Harappan times, we know for sure that cotton was produced during the Harappan times, and this evidence comes handy in establishing that there is some kind of a break so far as the continuum of tradition between Harappa and Vedic times are concerned. So, Vedic people are not aware of cotton, early Vedic people are not aware of cotton, whereas Harappans were using cotton. Now, coming to yet another component of economy, which is economic exchange and wealth redistribution. Now, let's try and understand as to what do we mean by wealth redistribution. It's one thing to produce something, it could be either on account of pastoral activities or a little bit of agriculture or whatever pursuits, craft or whatever productive activities that people engage in. But it is quite another thing to say like how the society distributed that amongst itself. Was that distribution, or so to say redistribution, done through primarily through market or exchange, or was there some kind of a cultural arrangement of gift giving and gift taking or reciprocity, barter and so forth. So, that is what we are going to track in this segment of our discussion. It seems that in the early Vedic times, market oriented economic exchange is not existent. When we say market oriented, it is basically production not for consumption, but production for selling it, which all of us today are so well socialized with. But it seems in Vedic times, in the early Vedic times, that people primarily produced for consumption purpose, and there was very little of production for exchange purpose as such. Therefore, market had very limited scope to develop in the early Vedic times, and of course, there must have been exchange, but that could have been facilitated through some rituals, customs or fairs, festivals or sacrifices and so forth, or political meetings. That is what we are going to see. This process, this tradition of gift giving or dana dakshina, as referred to in Rig Veda, is something which works as a redistributive mechanism on the occasions of big sacrifices or political meetings. So, whatever was procured as items of or resources during the war raids, or the booty that was captured during these raids or the wars, which all of us are so familiar with in the Rig Vedic times. In fact, the word for the war loot is loptra. So, that is the war booty. War booty is referred to as loptra in Rig Veda, and wealth or the prizes which were won in these raids or competitions alike, they are referred to as pan or dhan. So, this is the root root word for wealth as such, and we will see as to what constituted wealth. In fact, the war booty and the focus which is attached to particular kinds of war booty, we find many references to cattle, horses, women slaves, but land is somewhat missing or not so important item of war booty or capture. Of course, there are frequent usage of terms like ansh or bhag, which are again important because it has some connotation of share or sharing of whatever has been obtained as war booty or loptra, and it has pertinence to the mechanism of redistribution of wealth which is procured in these raids. So, we have the chiefs, the rajas redistributing these loptra or war booty in assemblies like vidhat or gana to both the wish who are the common people, as well as the priests who are conducting the sacrifices. So, whatever is procured in the warfare is redistributed on these occasions of Vidhat or Gan, and who are the recipients? Common people, who are the direct producers, the Vish, as well as the Brahmins who are working as priests in these sacrifices and so forth. So, that is how the redistribution as a process is happening in the Rigvedic times, and that is how the surplus generated through warfare or war booty is redistributed. The chiefs acquired wealth also not only on account of the Loptra, but also on account of Bali that we referred to earlier. So, that is yet another source of resource mobilization. So, one is the warfare and the war booty, the other is Bali that we have already discussed, that in the early Vedic times it is voluntary. So, since the Raja protects the cattle and is regarded as the first among the equals in the clan, in the group, in the kin group, therefore, there is some kind of cultural behavior as such, code of conduct, that when people come to these sacrifices organized at the behest of these Rajas, they come with some gifts, and the king is also obliged to give them return gifts. In fact, in such circumstances, generosity of the king is measured by the kind of gifts that they give in return in reciprocity. So, there is this element very much present in Rigved, and the Bali that is accumulated by the ruling class are, as we said, voluntary in nature in the early Vedic period, and they generally included, again we find if we look at the breakup of Bali, it will include cattle items, dairy products, and little bit of grain as well. So, little bit of agriculture that they are familiar with. So, they come with a little bit of grains, but primarily it is cattle and dairy products, dairy wealth that we get to see as Bali being offered to the ruling class, to the Raja. Now, so the total Bali which is under the command of the king or the Raja on such occasions again gets redistributed, and there are various means through which it gets redistributed. Primarily there are three such means. Of course, a share, a bhag of the Bali is destroyed or consumed in the sacrificial offerings. So, in the Havan, whatever is offered to Agni Devta, so that is consumed. It could be ghee, it could be butter, it could be milk or other such products offered as part of Bali. Then some portion or one share of the Bali also is consumed in the sacrificial feasts that or you can say communal feast which is organized at the behest of the king, at the behest of the Raja, which usually accompanied these sacrifices. So, on these occasions of big sacrifices, common people, the Vish who came to see that in order to participate, they were offered sumptuous food as part of the festivity, as part of the communal feasts. And so, a portion of Bali is consumed also in this communal feast, and the other portion, the other component of Bali gets consumed as the dan and dakshina, the gift giving to the priests, and the priests are given these dan and dakshina to enhance the donor's prestige. And so, there are dan stutis which are sung by the priests, which in a way gives some kind of a legitimacy to these rajas, to these rulers, and that is how we see some kind of a symbiotic relationship developing between the two top social categories, that is the Brahmins and the Rajanya or the Kshatriya. And there is some bit of distanciation that happens between these two categories on one side and the common people, that is Vish, on the other. But that was to happen subsequently. In the early Vedic times, if at all there is any distanciation, it is very rudimentary, it is not very apparent. Therefore, it is why we discussed all these is that it is through this mechanism of redistribution which appears to be a little bit asymmetrical, because the king is likely to give more of such gifts to his kith and kin or maybe the priest, and the same sense of equity is not followed when that redistribution happens with reference to the Vish, because they are not given dan dakshinas, they are simply given communal feasts, and that is how there is some asymmetry developing in these redistributive mechanisms. Over a period of time, not here, over a period of time, this gets structured in other forms, and we will see as we move on to the later Vedic times that the same term Bali now starts becoming different in meaning, in the sense that it becomes coercive in the later Vedic times. It no more remains voluntary. So, in the later Vedic times, if we were to make comparisons, of course, in geographical terms, we have already seen that there is some kind of a widening of geographical horizon of the people of the Aryans who initially settled in the Sapt-Sindhu area to begin with during the Rigvedic period or early Vedic period, but by the time we move on to the later Vedic times, that is 1000 to 600 BC, we find that these people had progressed deep eastward, and even the middle Gangetic plains are colonized by the Aryans and the local people who are of course in contact with them, and that is how commingling is happening. To begin with, it is limited to the upper Gangetic plains in the later Vedic times, and subsequently the middle Gangetic plains also got colonized by the time we reach the end of later Vedic period around 6th century BC. So, in the later Vedic times, again as we study the later Vedic texts, Samved, Yajurved, Atharvaved, and the Brahmanas, Aranyaks and so forth, we find that there is increased reliance on agriculture as compared to the predominance of pastoralism in the early Vedic times. So, there is more emphasis in these texts on agriculture and agricultural operations. In fact, the later sections of Rigved itself, which is collapsing almost with the later Vedic times, beginning of the later Vedic times, we had referred to some portions of Rigved being written subsequently, which is closer to the times of the later Vedic period. Now, there itself we find increased reference to activities like sowing of seeds, cutting, threshing, winnowing, and plows drawn by oxen. In later texts, the number of oxen goes on increasing. It could be conventional, but certainly it is indicative of increased reliance on agriculture and plowed fields or the process of plowing itself and so forth. So, in the later texts, the number of oxen who are supposed to draw these plows goes on increasing. There are numbers referred to as 6, 8, 12 and 24 oxen pulling these plow. So, was there a deep plowing which is being implied through a huge number of oxen, or was it conventional? That is something that can be debated. Nevertheless, there is indisputable evidence which tells us that agriculture is fast making inroads into the lifestyle of these people. The plow that we get to hear of in the later Vedic times through these texts and literary evidences appears to be made of hard wood, still not iron. So, the wood which are used to make plow are udumbar or khadir. So, they are the trees whose timber was used to make these plows, and plows are important only in the context of agriculture. So, they had taken to agriculture, or they were increasingly taking to agriculture, yet they are not users of iron plowshare. Although towards the end of the later Vedic period, we do have some evidence of iron share found from Jakhera, but in general its usage seems to be limited. We also have evidence of iron axe at Noh, which comes from a layer which can be dated to around 1100 to 900 BC, which is around the time that the Rig Vedic society ends and later Vedic times begin. We have the legends associated with Shatpatha Brahman, which I had referred to earlier also, where Rajan is supposed to have held a stick fired by a Brahmin, and he throws it into the forest, and the entire area which is crossed by that stick, fired stick, of course implying that the forest gets burnt, and the point where the stick falls, the entire area comes under the Rajanya's control. And we have one such story or legend in Shatpatha Brahman, where the stick falls on the banks of Sadanir, which is identified as Gandak river in Bihar today. So, we can see the stretch of the entire Gangetic belt, middle Gangetic belt getting or being brought under, or we can say clearance of forest, which of course had implication with advancement of agriculture, or at least onset of agriculture in these areas in a big way. Talking of the later Vedic references to grains in contrast to its Rig Vedic counterpart, we find that in addition to Yava, which of course is mentioned in Rig Vedic source, we also have Vrihi, which stands for rice, and the root word for Vrihi is Arichi, which is again a word of Dravidian origin. It is not an Indo-European language group word. So, again the point that we have been making time and again is that agriculture becomes important to the Aryans once they settle in this area, and it is a byproduct of commingling or coming together of the local people with the Aryans, and therefore we find that rice, the root word for rice, Arichi, which is mentioned in later Vedic texts as Vrihi, is also of non-Indo-European language, and it is a word of Dravidian origin. And we have archaeological evidence from Bolan Valley itself in the eastern Uttar Pradesh bordering Bihar area, Mirzapur area, from where we have archaeological evidence of rice cultivation, or maybe rice usage as part of food basket, coming from a layer which can be dated to around 6000 BC, although it has been contested by several other historians, but at least one can testify to the fact that rice has pretty long anteriority in the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, and maybe that it is as a result of contact of the Aryans with these people living in this area that they got to include this as part of their vocabulary in later Vedic text. Also, we have evidence of barley and rice at Atranji Kher, and rice has also been found from Hastinapur area. So, that tells us that in the later Vedic times, it is not only Yava, rather there is an increase in the number of grains that we get to see in the later Vedic times. Irrigation was still unimportant in the later Vedic times, because most of the areas in which settlement was done are elevated areas, and in the absence of extractive technology and energy, of course, you could not have thought of artificial modes of irrigation around this time. And transplantation of rice, which is so critical to enhanced production of rice, that is also not practiced in the later Vedic times. It is only towards the end of the later Vedic times, around 6th century BC, that transplantation starts becoming important, which greatly increased the rice output in areas which are naturally waterlogged on account of increased rainfall in the middle Gangetic plains. Also, in terms of grains, we have mention of Godhum, which stands for wheat, although they are not so important. We have reference to Mudga, which stands for moong, Mas, which is urad ki dal, and also sugarcane. Again, we find that these the area that we are talking of, middle Gangetic plain area, even today these grains and these forms of cultivation are very much in practice in 21st century India. Overall, what we find in the later Vedic economy is that there are obvious limitations, in the sense that use of effective iron tools are still not in practice, and transplantation or irrigation of rice is also not in practice. So these are the limitations, but agriculture is fast becoming important, and that is also testified by a very solid layer, a thick layer of later Vedic stratum in archaeological records, which is painted greyware stratum. So they are settling in one area for a longer duration of time, testifying to the fact that agriculture has become the mainstay of their life in the later Vedic times.
Thank you so much, sir. So friends, this was our transition, as I mentioned earlier, from the early Vedic to the later Vedic. And of course, we have more to follow as part of this series, which shall be having, we will have in our upcoming lecture. So stay tuned in and watch out for all those. Of course, before we sign out, we must thank sir. Thank you so much, sir. Please continue to be associated with us throughout these lectures. And thank you, friends, for watching. Have a great day.